Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Ellen Alderman. I am the Deputy Director of Exhibitions and Public Programs here at the Graham. Don't worry, I'll get that, don't worry. We're so glad to have you all here today and to welcome poet Dionne Brand to Chicago. Well, I'm sure Dionne can't be the first poet to speak at the Graham. She is the first in recent history, so this is a very exciting moment for all of us, especially since we are very pleased to have teamed up with our friends at the Poetry Foundation to co-present this event. Our thanks go out to Henry Beenan and Stephen Young for their efforts to make this happen with such expediency. If you're perhaps visiting the Graham for the first time thanks to this collaboration, our mission is to foster diverse and challenging ideas about architecture and its role in the arts, culture, and society. We do this through making project-based grants to individuals and organizations and producing exhibitions, events, and publications. As a part of this programming, Dionne will today be responding to our current exhibition by artist Torkwase Dyson, who is in residence with us this summer as one of our inaugural Graham Foundation Fellows. Her exhibition, Torkwase Dyson in the Wynter-Wells School for Environmental Liberation, named for Jamaican writer Sylvia Wynter and American civil rights leader Ida B. Wells, surrounds us this afternoon. Throughout the exhibition, abstraction is used to ask questions about what is at stake for the production of form in the context of geography and the environment as they are shaped by the volatile economic and political climates of the Anthropocene. In her talk entitled The Shape of Language, Dionne weaves a narrative around these forms as it relates to her own work, investigating the challenges of writing and form finding today by including selections from her forthcoming book, The Blue Clerk, which will be published by Duke later this summer. Following the talk, we'll host a reception down in the library, so please join us downstairs to continue the conversation over a glass of wine and enjoy 10% off everything in the bookshop this afternoon. Dionne Brand is a Canadian poet. Born in Trinidad, Brand attended the University of Toronto, earning degrees in philosophy and English and a master's in philosophy of education. Her books include No Language is Neutral, Land to Light On, and Thirsty. Brand is also the author of the acclaimed novels In Another Place, Not Here, and At the Full and Change of the Moon. Her works of nonfiction include Bread Out of Stone and A Map to the Door of No Return. In addition to her literary accomplishments, Brand is professor of English in the School of English and Theater Studies at the University of Guelph. Now, I am going to throw you a curveball, and I'm going to welcome Torkwase Dyson to say a few words about Dionne, and then we will hear from Dionne. Thank you for being here.
Thank you all so much for coming. I wanted to give a very brief introduction, sort of a word towards how Dionne Brand in a very short period of time has sort of affected my thinking and changed the language, some of the language around the work. More specifically, as I was thinking through and experimenting with the project Wynter-Wells, initially the name was the Wynter-Wells Drawing School for Environmental Justice. After one afternoon in conversation with Brand, who I met through Christina Sharp and Christina Sharp's work, I thought about changing the name, and shortly after I did, to the Wynter-Wells Drawing School for Environmental Liberation. And through a conversation at dinner, she was acutely aware of the difference between justice and liberation, right? Working inside a system in relationship to working outside a system that has been toiled and pushed away and conquered, right, towards a liberation. So I've written just a few words to sort of continue how after things we think about each other's work and we sort of move towards ideas of new air, new space, and liberation. Okay, briefly. Yesterday I was sitting with my friend Andres L. Hernandez, and he spoke the word aeration. We thought through this notion of the breathing ground. We spoke on about and how as artists, we turn over, toil, borrow, toss, and reach for air. We reach for air as we trouble and take care of the ground we know. We reach through the language of air. This ethos is a science as we engineer our bodies toward abstraction, forming questions of self-relationship and self-liberation. I've only known Dionne Brand a short clock time, but she has brought not only air, the new language of air, but the new language of space, light, closer to my best geographic self. Today, I welcome Dionne Brand and look forward to more air.
Thank you, Torkwase. I'm happy to be here and happy to be in the presence of your work, which, the first time I saw in New York, I remember I was sitting in the room and you were speaking, and I just felt the work as there's someone in the room. There's someone in the room, right? The great movement in it, the great intelligence in it. I just felt, what is that? I kept having to look around, right? And I'm going to feel that way as I stand here. And I think when I first entered the room, I thought, I shouldn't be standing here. I should be standing there also, because it's like turning your back to somebody, right? So anyway, thank you for having me, and thank you for thinking of me to invite me to be here. I'm going to do a couple things, and thank you to the Graham Foundation and Ellen for inviting me to. I'm going to do a few things. Because it's funny, you find yourself on the same wavelength as, artists around you, and I think that's where I've been with your work, and that's what I recognized on entering a room and a space with your work, that somehow we're in the same conversation, we're living in the same time, and thinking ourselves out of that time, hopefully. So I want to begin first with a poem from my last book of verse, which is called Ossuaries. And then I want to talk a little bit about narrative and poetry, which I think is in deep conversation with you, where I think it engages your own practice. And then I want to do a kind of meditation on the hypershapes and latitude and longitude of this site that works here. And then I'll read several small pieces from the forthcoming book, The Blue Clerk. So, this is Ossuary 1. I lived and loved, some might say, in momentous times. Looking back, my dreams were full of prisons. In our narcotic drifting slumbers, so many dreams, of course, were full of prisons. Mine were without relief. In our induced days and in our wingless days, my every waking was incarcerated, each square meter of air so toxic with violence. The atmospheres were breathless there. The bronchial trees were ligatured with carbons. Some damage I had expected, but no one expects the violence of glances, of offices, of walkways and train stations, of bathroom mirrors, especially the vicious telephones, the coarseness of daylight, the brusque decisions of air, the casual homicides of dresses. What brutal hours, what brutal days. Do not say, oh, find the good in it. Do not say there was virtue. There was no virtue, not even in me. Let us begin from there. Restraining metals covered my heart. Rivulets of some unknown substance transfused my veins. At night, especially at night, it is always at night, a wall of concrete enclosed me. It was impossible to open my eyes. I lived like this, as I said, without care. Tanks rolled into my life, Grenades took root in my uterus. I was sickly each morning so dearly. What to say? Life went on around me. I laughed. I had drinks. I gathered with friends. We grinned our aluminum teeth. We exhaled our venomous breaths. We tried to be calm in the invisible architecture. We incubated like cluster bombs, whole lives waiting, whole stellar regions, discoveries of nebulae and compassion. From the cities, the electric rains pierced us. The ceaseless bitter days folded like good linen. The phosphorus streets gave off their harmful lights. We bit our fingernails to blue buttons. We staggered at the high approach of doorways, plunged repeatedly to our deaths, only to be revived by zoos, parades, experiments, exhibitions, television sets. Oh, we wanted to leave. We wanted to leave the aspirated syllables and villages, the skeletal dance floors, the vacant moons that tortured us. When the jailers went home and the spectators drifted away, and the scientists finished their work like a bad dog chained to an empty gas station for blue nights, I got worse and worse, so troubling. I would fall dead like a specimen at the anthropometric spectacles on the Champ de Mars, the Jardin d'Acclimatation, the mobile addresses of the autopsy fields. Though I could see no roads, I was paid for losing everything, even eyesight. I lived in the eternal villages. I lived like a dog, a shaggy doll with a bell. I thought this was the way people lived. I lived. I had nights of insentient adjectives. Shale nights, pebbled nights, stone nights, igneous nights. Of these nights, the speechlessness. I recall the right rib of the lit moon, the left hip of the lit moon. What is your name, they asked. I said nothing. I heard the conspiratorial water. I heard the only stone I ate her shoulder. I could not hear myself. You are mistaken, I said to no one. The chain link fences glittered like jewelry, expensive jewelry, portable jewelry. I lost verbs, whole, like the hull of almonds. After consideration, you will discover, as I, that verbs are a tragedy, a bleeding cliffside, explosions. I'm better off without them, with vermilion, candles, this bedding, this mercy, this stretcher, this solitary, perfectible strangeness and edge, such cloth, this compass of mine, of earth, of mourners, of these reasons, of which fairgrounds, of which theories, of plurals, of specimens, of least and most, of expeditions, then travels and wonders, then journeys, then photographs and photographs, of course, the multiplications of which, the enormity of this, and drill bits and hammers, and again handcuffs, and again rope, coarse business, but there, some investigations, then again the calculations, such hours, such expansions, the mind dizzy with leaps, such handles of wood, of thought, and then science, all murder, melancholic skulls, pliant to each fingertip, these chromatic scales, these calipers, the needle in the tongue, whole diameters, circumferences, locutions, an orgy of measurements, a festival of inches, gardens and paraphernalia of measurements, unificatory data, curious data, beautiful and sensuous data. Oh yes, beautiful. Now, of attractions and spectacles of other sheer forces and types in the universe, the necessary exotic measurements, rarest measuring tapes, a sudden unificatory nakedness, bifurcatory nakedness of numbers, of violent phantasms at exhibitions again, of walks, of promenades at fairs with products, new widgets, human widgets with music, oh wonders. The implications then. Early in this life, like mountains, already pictures and pictures before pictures, after pictures and cameras. There's sickness, eye murder, murder sickness, hunger sickness. This serendipity of calculators, of footprints with fossils, their wingspan of all time. At crepuscules, rare peacetime, if only like water in daytime, no solace, so different from solitude, all madness, so furious, so numerous, the head, the markets, the soles of the feet, so burnt, so thin, and the taste so meager, so light-headed, the cloud flashes, the lightning geometry, the core of reflectivity, so vastly vast. The weight now lumens of aches, such aches, the horizontal and the vertical aches of lightning, its acoustics, loud pianos, percussive yet, strings and quartets, multicellular runnels yet, and yet the altitude of the passageway, its precipitation and grand arithmetic, the segments, the latitudes of where, and here, its contours, its eccentric curvatures, so presently angular and nautical, all presently just fine. My lungs, just fine. Hypothesis, absolutely, but just fine. Why lungs? Strange theory. Oh yes. And the magnitude of jaundice, trenches like war, continuous areas and registers, logarithms so unexplainable, rapid scales, high notes, besides, anyway, so thermal, atmospheric, wondrous, aggressions, approximately here, elaborate like radiation and seismic, yes, all over, the body's symptoms of algebraic fluids, tiredness for one, weariness actually, weary with magnetic embryos, petals, yes, petals of sick balm, please now, yes, for my esophagus, analgesics of indigo, of wires, of electric shocks. Why? Eucalyptus leaves, of course, lemongrass, laburnum, please, lion's claw, remedies of cloves, bitter bark, still birdless though, worldless. Asthma with blueness, then music, gardens, truthfully nauseous with tonsured numbers, volumes of fibers, embroidery, and hairnets of violence, blue like machine guns, of course, knives, extensions of blueness. All right then, wherever, same radiations, lines in the forehead, tapers, electrodes, invisible to the eyes, official hammers and corkscrews, official grass, official cities now for appearances, after all this, all these appearances. Generous for certain, scraggly, wan and robust appearances, assignments and hidden schedules of attendance, a promise of blindness, a lover's clasp of violent syntax, and the beginning syllabi of verblessness. So that's that. And there's a lot of verblessness. I was just wondering how to describe the world without a verb, and so over the course of my, and I think that set of verblessness hits off of this wall, yeah. And so that's the kind of affinity that I feel with Torkwase Dyson's work, that I felt there was something between those two things. So over the course of my writing, I've tried to articulate what I think it is that poetry can accomplish. And in my practice in poetry, I've tried to produce a grammar in which black existence might be the thought and not the unthought. It might be. I'm interested in poetry's diacritic possibilities for black existence and its capacities for overwriting the narratives of non-being in the diaspora. I'm reading poetry's diacritic here alongside the way in which Torkwase Dyson reads abstraction and abstraction's capacities. When she says, "I begin to understand that surviving through abstraction is my formal project today." I am trying to think my own way through these possibilities, to understand how surviving through poetry is my formal project. Much in the way that diacritical marks supplement certain alphabets, changing the sound, tone, or meaning of certain words, poetry in my formulation changes what I see as the racist alphabets of narrative, the prevalent modes of speech, and the key impediments to black being. I'm proposing here a radical indictment of narrative. I do write novels, so, nevertheless, I'm putting this in the room and in my own mind, in my own work. I'm trying to think my way through that too. I think that for black people, narrative as it is currently constituted is incapable of transmitting or sounding a tomorrow beyond brutalization. It is incapable of transmitting or sounding a present, a today, since our lived today is cluttered in frequencies of oppression and responses to oppression. In the presence of our bodies, all narrative utterances are full of attention to racism, bracketed by racism, animated by racism. Our language is noded, mined secretly and publicly by racism. Self-reference, self-description are circumscribed in this mined terrain of the narrative. Poetry, perhaps, I thought, with its capacities to deposit and unearth plural meanings and with its refusal of a particular interrogative gaze, might cut out a space toward a description of being in the diaspora. And if we think about reading practices that attend to these two shapes, poetry and narrative, I suggest that the reader interrogates narrative, but poetry interrogates the reader. So these are just propositions, I'm thinking about them in a really... Poetry is pressure, like pressure on verbal matter, pressure on air, sustained pressure on space. Narrative contains a system of representation and is a system of representation that contains the extension of the unliberation project in the present, the abstract of poetry versus the figure of narrative is what Torkwase helps me to think about. Let me quote from the description of Torkwase's work, and I quote, "Using concepts of black compositional thought and hypershape, she partially eliminates the pictorial in favor of form and space to theorize a new system of geometric abstraction." Poetry I take as abstraction, and I'll be definitive and say that poetry is always abstract, even when it is narrative poetry. Well, good poetry anyway. That is poetry that fills out its entire capacities on line and meter and metaphor and pressure on the unknown, putting different things together to make kind of new meaning all the time. That work that keeps happening, or that should keep happening in a line, and in every line. And here's poetry's power, I think. The reader's response is tangential to poetry, whereas it is crucial to narrative. Poetry requires a deciphering of meaning, whereas narrative enjoins or may enjoin. Let me not damn all narrative. God knows I have 5 novels, so okay. But nevertheless, I understand in working in that material the trouble of getting it to do that thing, getting it to leap over that project. Yeah, the ways in which certain kinds of histories lay in it, the way in which the known world and known relationships lay in it. So I want to offer poetry's capacity as a diacritical, as abstraction against narration, as a diacritical form, that is to say, an overwriting, a meaning displacement of what Christina Sharp has called the dysgraphia, produced by the resonating historical tragedy of slavery of black people in the Americas the ongoing dysgraphia of disaster, she writes, continues to be disseminated, quote, by way of rapid, deliberate, repetitive, and wide circulation on television and social media, newspapers. That is the whole system of production of representation of the black social, material, and psychic death. We know this dysgraphia as also produced historically and in the contemporary through an abundance of literary narrative, disquisition, and dissertation. This is constantly being, and the pressure of that shape on black life, right? One is constantly responding to these laid-in narratives. I suggest that unwillingly and inadvertently, and here's my self-criticism in a way, narrative attempts at response, our own narrative attempts at response to and rebuttal of the dysgraphia by those of us who write against and in opposition to it necessarily imports, albeit in order to refute the language of the dysgraphia. Narrative is, to my mind, always almost always implicated in the colonial imperialist racist project. With our best efforts, with one's best effort one writes back to or against first the existence and then the persistence of the dominant narratives of coloniality and racism and imperialism. Character in narrative in this sense, and landscape for that matter, are weighted with whiteness as a fundamental originary category. The black body in narrative is always spectacular, always spectacularized, marked. The dysgraphia of dominant and of dominating narratives unwrites and makes incoherent black presence, as be. Our bodies are always active. It's like I'm at work all the time, like, walk outside, I'm at work in some narrative of, in some public narrative, right? So it's always at work, always active, always enacting in the register of this narrative, or in the register of what I call in an earlier book to light on the hard gossip of race that inhabits this road. So predicated, this narrative language compels us to answer in the same language, struck through and enlivened by the action of our bodies in race. We are fluent in this language, and we often respond in it, taking apart the attacks of race language by employing the very dysgraphia. Interred in narratives of racism, we try to detonate them with counter-narratives. Right? And we wait for narrative to do what wash might do. Just saying. It's a curious sentence, yes. In a material war, had we summoned the equivalent of the literary ammunitions we've launched at racism, our sovereignty would already have been won. We live instead in a language of convenience, of instrumentation, of stipulating the dysgraphia. Right? So that's the stipulation, and then we précis our lives and submit the text to the dominant culture for inclusion. We are people without a translator. The language we use already contains our demise, and any response contains that demise, as each response emboldens and strengthens the language it hopes to undermine. At least that's what I deal with every time I make a sentence. Like, how is this working? Yeah? In effect, one is called to narrate one's non-being. Narrative ends in a rudimentary representation, continuous rudimentary representations of what the poet Cornelius Eady so eloquently called in his work brutal imagination, the brutal imagination, a continuous recycling of character, already known, already read, already in the zoo, already in the museum. Have you read that book, Brutal Imagination?
Yeah.
Oh, gorgeous book.
Yeah.
Just amazing book. Yeah, just a fabulous book. Am I trying to remember a verse from it?
Eternal backseat.
Yeah. Oh, later. I have often thought that the radical move would to cease working in narrative altogether, and to be silent, to see silence as the radical project, unresponsive to gossip, unmoved by violence, uninvolved in exchanging death for less death, which is the bargain of narrative. The work of poetry might dislodge us from these accounts of non-being. Who is the person who might appear if I cut away that presumption, that demand for the black spectacular? Who might appear? What might happen? That's the thought that I keep constantly as I work. What might appear? Who might appear? Who is that? Who is that? Who is that figure that I am trying to describe? So poetry in my practice brings into view such a being, hopefully, one who might be unavailable to the rules of character, who is uninterested in the fixed race definitions of modernity, and who refuses the efforts to renovate narratives of coloniality and imperialism. Yeah? This being owes no exposition for their presence or actions, most certainly not to that spectatorship. And the clerk of my forthcoming work, the Blue Clerk, engages this tension of poetry as the diacritical in an attempt to write a true inventory, beginning with the small objects and effects, with nouns and adjectives. And I think the ending of the work that I did in Ossuaries with that verblessness is the beginning of that kind of work. So, in thinking about Torkwase Dyson's work, I've looked at the hypershapes and the latitude and longitude of this site, the pieces, and I've written or read a kind of meditation of them, and that I want to share with you. So in kind of looking at them and thinking about what they speak, what I'm hearing them say, or what I am humbly trying to turn into a language of that shape, of those shapes. It must have been curious to fall out of language and to fall into language so abruptly and at the same time. To fall out of body and into body at the same time. To see yourself as wreck and self. You must have been then at the crux of knowledge. Knowledge shared but no longer observed except by you and millions now consigned in the world you dropped out of, you dropped into. How language must have changed, did change, to look not at the abjection, though abjection is certainly narratable, but as consciousness looking at the world go on, observing the angular change of the sky, the wild splinters of a board. What is it to fall out of narrative? Hyper shapes, hyper look, hyper thought, the shape that exceeds the space, the look that exceeds the gaze, the thought that exceeds the narrative, the mind to exceed, what to do with this view of the world. You now know the intimate weight of a boat, the sweat of wood, the nothing of a house, the density of self, the movement in the parabola, the parable, the isosceles, the livability of the rectangle. Someone is in the room, scalene, the equilateral distance, the obtuse radiation. Shall we choose gills? Shall we choose water? Shall we choose breathlessness, breathless matter, slippery, then distance? Shall we make a mouth, an eye, a door out of nowhere, between the weight of themselves in doorways, between veins, floors? Hunger is tenacious. Hunger is tenacious, undone of compasses, unvisit walls. Cigarettes is gone any given year. Salt, how, been, and when. That's what I think these are saying. What time is it? I can do 3 more things? Okay. So now I just want to read from my new book, which is called The Blue Clerk. And just a few short pieces from them. The Blue Clerk is a book about an argument between the author and the clerk. The author, it starts from the premise that writing is a negotiation between what is written and what is withheld. And the clerk handles everything that's withheld. So for every right-hand page that's produced, which the author produces beautifully and neatly, the clerk has to hold like the voluminous weight of the left-hand page. All that is left, all that the author has not put in for various reasons, not all good reasons. Yeah? And so this book, The Blue Clerk, is an argument between these two functions of what is being withheld, and it's the clerk's attempt to supersede the author in presenting her own pages. Okay? So verso 16.6. I am clinically aware. I am flying into light. That is, I am flying west, flying into the recess of light, where light is ending. I have taken each detail of myself apart and placed them on the counter. These are the individual bits of evidence. I expect an arrest to be made based on these facts. Here is my heel. Here is its classification. Who is in detention except me? The commissioners and stenographers must be notified, I said. Is there no one at the desk? What will happen to my files? I am aware. I am always aware, clinically aware. Verso 16.8. I went, in other words, to all the commissions. I said, here is my body, protect it. I said, arrest someone immediately. I would like you to issue a warrant. Here is my fingernail. Send a team. If you can, arrest. Seek out the perpetrators. I have given you all the evidence. Here is my signature. Nothing about me is false. I am surrendering my body to you in whole. Someone must be charged with murder. I said, why are you hesitating? I have surrendered myself as I was advised. I am naked and have no visions. Here, I have signed the papers. You have my authority, such as it is, the garment of glass, my shattered self, the shatterings I call them, my limbs, my ankles, my jaw. Nothing here is missing. Someone is responsible. I went to the quarter of mornings. I said, here, let us begin, refreshed. When will the charges be heard? I asked. I am still here, blue to the heels. I insist on my innocence. I am open like a baby. I refuse cynicism on this. I will wait all night if it takes for the report to be handled. I can hardly disappear. The bailiff, with respect, is one of them. So is the lawyer. I have brought myself as the final forensic datum. It should be plain. Arrest someone. I have now been here for quite some time. I no longer know what language I speak or whether this one is the original. I no longer exist, it seems, anywhere, not this year. I have been here each spring, ready to leave, certain of what I can be certain of. Verse 13. Blue tremors, blue position, blue suppuration. The clerk is considering blue havoc, blue thousands, blue shoulder. Where these arrive from, blue expenses. The clerk hears humming in her ears, blue handling, she answers. Any blue? She asks the author. Any blue nails today? Did you send me, as I asked, blue ants? The author asks, blue drafts? Perhaps blue virus, blue traffic would make a sense, says the clerk. Blue hinges, blue climbing. These would go together under normal circumstances. The author actually doesn't hear a thing the blue clerk says. Under these circumstances, when the blue clerk sits in the blue clerk's place, making the blue clerk's language. Systolic blue. Any day, it will be blue now. Reloading blue. Blue disciplines. The blue clerk would like a blue language, or a lemon language, or a violet language. Blue arrivals. Oh yes. (18.4.1). The clerk has a deep, system of categorization. Okay. Blue, the clerk has collected from exhaustion. Blue maximums, blue wine, blue safety, blue descent, blue crossroads, blue marrow, blue speed, blue balance, blue handling, blue corks, blue apples, blue positions, blue opportunities, blue discriminations, blue disciplines, blue request, blue hinges, blue decline, blue draft, blue sleep, blue protein, blue starch, blue nibbed, blue climbing, blue ditches, blue maintenance, blue hole, blue sustenance, blue schemes, blue visas, blue sex, blue help, blue storage, poised blue, blue fingerprints, intended blue. 18.4.2. Violet. The clerk has collected violet. Violet hands, violet notes, violet coolness, violet edging, violet halls, violet breath, violet hammer, violet digits, violet watches, violet management, violet suspension, chill violet, violet taken, violet ambulances, violet February, violet feel, violet episode, violet shame, violet paves, violet coast, violet sticks, violet recovery, violet hoarfrost, violet openings, violet asylum, violet introduction, violet fame, violet probations, violet becomes, violet chained, violet whimper, violet officials, violet blunder, violet early, violet help. Thank you. She did go on, but it was too long. The author made some edits. But I just want to talk to you. But, yeah. What?
I got to open my mouth.
Clearly you can see that. Yes. I mean, I find your work so fabulous. Have you ever heard Coltrane's Venus? Yeah? No? Yeah, Coltrane's Venus is like 8 minutes. It's Coltrane playing with Rashid Ali, playing drums, and Coltrane. It's one of Coltrane's last recordings. It's on an album or two, but one of them called Interstellar Space, I think, yeah? Or Intergalactic Space, right? Interstellar Space. And there are just 8 minutes of the most wonderful speaking out and beyond the time that we live, right? It's like Coltrane blowing into a future. Because if you listen to that, you hear it like, what year is this? It sounds like 25, 26 or something, right? It's way beyond the time. And I often think that is the job sometimes of black artists to blow out of the time that we live in. It's like sending word to some place where it may be understood in the future, but that the time that we live in is so carceral. But we know what we're talking about, and so that's what So when I see your work, that is what it makes me feel, that it blows out into the place where we ought to be living or something. Yeah.
If you can imagine, if anyone can imagine, listening to you, I'm overwhelmed by the things that I cannot say. In my mind, it just, the language doesn't occur to me. No matter, it's just not there, right? So when I'm making, and as all visual artists who are makers, to struggle in the silence and alone in the stillness, and to develop a sort of visual language that then people somehow feel partnered with in whatever way. And to have that next to your rigor alone, sort of made being is something that is, makes me feel really, really, as you talked about, a real profound sense of consciousness and awareness, right? In the stillness, the profoundness, the awareness of this moment right now, my own body, is a kind of existence that helps me know that when you toil with the narrative, I am toiling with the narrative deeply, and I didn't realize that necessarily so poignantly. I think I knew that I was refusing it in a way because oftentimes it's inefficient. But the way in which you talk about not only the refusal, but the sheer kind of journey that it's going to take to get at some kind of truism, right? So the even act of refusal kind of disappears. The sort of act of ambivalence disappears. Because those things, I think, I've built up in myself as an action towards something else. But you kind of obliterate those delays for me, and I get to just a kind of a making space that is that regards these histories as deserving to feel free, deserving, like the person who lives in the rectangle deserves to feel what I am feeling like right now listening to you. And I really don't know how else to talk about it. I'm really kind of beside myself, watching myself. watching myself have these thoughts.
Well, I thought that what you did in the hypershapes was, and that's why I took the thing about what it must have been to see, right? And you could take that seeing as seeing, as I say, abjection, but you take it as collecting knowledge, right? As suddenly becoming expert at seeing in another way, right? And I think that that's the gift that the person in the rectangle gives us. And then I think, well, what if I were to begin there? Like, what if I would begin with that knowledge, that those sets of knowledges collected from those spaces?
Right.
Because, like, those, you talk of improvisation, and those spaces had to be improvisational, right?
Right.
They were only meant to ensnare and encircle, but then how would I live after them? And I'm always like, grateful, wildly grateful for grateful to the people who sat in those spaces and allow me another sight, like allow me another angle. So I sometimes want to just go with that other angle. What's the other? Do you know what I mean?
Right, absolutely.
Even as the limited world wants to hold you into the tight, the tight known space, the tight space that's the only place your body is employed in a way.
Right.
And so I just thought that moment, I wrote a book called Map to the Door, No Return. And,
Yes.
and then,
yes.
and I thought of that space, that exit,
Yes.
as both a site of, it's a site of imprisonment, but it's also a site of improvisation. Like it's a leap out.
Yes.
Like, what would I be after that? Right? Like, I'd have to invent what I'm going to be.
Yes.
And I want to. So in my own work, I want to honor that heritage, like the business of the improvisatory out the door, the step out the door, or the area of that doorway as a deeply imaginative space. Yeah.
It's funny that when you're talking about, like if I scratch away the known, and if I take away what has been oftentimes inherited, and leap into a kind of sight from a sight, right? Sight is location, and sight is vision beyond. That kind of simultaneity and that kind of rhythm or tuning around our own behavior and our bodies, right? That's that deep synchronicity, I believe, has to come from a place of stillness and knowing, right? So when you talk about the Door of No Return, and I've made a couple of sculptures reconfiguring that circle, that circular site, that architectural moment where it was designed to, you talked about perspective, it was designed as a single point perspective site, this curve, right? This curve next to this circle, next to this ocean. And for me, thinking about, that lip, that jump, that leap, that moment of longitude, latitude, and to imagine or that I know something about it, or to imagine that the narratives that have come to me know completely about it, getting to the space where, like, that's the delusion, that the narrative can completely sustain and know all there is to know about that. And to trouble that narrative as a visual artist, and to keep the discipline of troubling it, right? And to know that if we're cornered in a particular kind of visual culture that's in the atmosphere of anti-Black, and we're still sort of juggling all of that, both visual sort of linguistic kind of terror. What does it mean to also scratch away what I think I know about that, and what am I left with? A kind of like Coltrane, this pure invention, and not only invention, but exhausting the possibilities of the things I don't already know. Right? And that pressure of containing oneself in the discipline of exhausting the things that I don't know, to beget something else.
The Coltrane piece, what it does too is he starts out with a line, or at least I call it a line. I know nothing about music, so I call it a line. And then that line breaks up and breaks up and breaks up into, not into any known thing, right? And reaches out and goes out and out and out. And there is Rashid Ali kind of sustaining him under that line all the time, but doing a set of things himself, right? A set of, because he has to be as agile as the breakup. So he has to break up in order to sustain the agility. I mean, and then the horn tries to return, or that's an assumption. I don't know if the horn tries to return. The horn wants to remember the line, let us say, but it never comes back the same way. Right? It is already fractured, already moved out.
Maybe that's the violet.
Yeah.
Blue Clerk. Yeah.
You think?
Maybe.
Okay, maybe.
Just thinking about
Maybe.
what you just read.
Yeah.
And the collecting of the violet, and then the violet being not only matter, right?
Yeah.
But ethos and memory and these sort of the ways in which things are, and I don't want to say happen again and again, but that doesn't mean they repeat.
Exactly.
It means they happen again and again.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
In the way in which we choose to color that again and again, and not be locked into it as something as matter. Right? So when Coltrane is thinking about like returning that tuning, he understands that sometimes you break out of repetition, but then again and again it still occurs.
Right, and it's already been affected by whatever has happened to it as it went, and so on. Yeah.
I wanted to also talk about the longitude, latitude pieces downstairs, and when you talk about the splintering of the wood and thinking of the hand and the meditation on the hypershapes. And what I don't think I've talked about yet is that the piece downstairs is a sort of explosion of the Box Brown's box, right? So it's not a representation of the box.
Right.
It's a thinking through of the corners or the site outside the box, while dealing with the site inside the box, right? So working with this sort of simultaneity outside the outside, but also, a space of deep seeing intimacy when one is with one's own body, kind of curved and crouched over. So when I think about surface, and when you talk about surface, I am interested in the sort of visceral nature that I think you evoke in the work that takes my imagination. Right? It's not the same. It's not a kind of facsimile. It's not a kind of representation in that way. But it takes the knowing of what pressure does, the science of and the physics of matter and how it changes over time, and then how that matter and change over time becomes a new potential for the haptic. Right? So all of this motion and distance and this idea around like black spatiality or black compositional thought is sort of rolled up in this touch, right? And the composition in a touch, right? Yeah. So I feel like when I'm listening to you and I'm thinking about how I touch a surface or how I make a surface, I also think about, again, trying to be in the moment, and watching my own hands make haptic, right? In relationship to those histories and regarding those histories as unfinished, right? So,
Isn't it Wilson Harris who talks about the unfinished genesis of the imagination? Do I make it right? Yeah. That there's a kind of that simply because all the stories have been collapsed into the story where whiteness is at the apex of the narrative or the subject of the narrative, yet there is all this knowledge, all this business still to be, at least that's how I read him, all this business still to be drawn in, still to be thought about, still to be read, lived. All this business that is in fact lived, to be recorded then, Yeah. Any questions?